So there's this story, and it appears 2 or 3 times in the Bible, and they can't quite remember, the people that write it. It's in a few of the different Gospels, and they can't quite remember some of the smaller details, but that's okay, because when you go out for a meal, you can't all remember some of the smaller details, but they all remember the bigger details of the story. And the bigger details of the story are this, that Jesus is at a dinner one night. He's invited to this guy's house, and the house is filled with other dinner guests and dignitaries and people that want to meet Jesus. And there's all this food being passed around on trays, flatbreads and hummus and lamb kebabs or something. And into this party that's mostly populated by blokes arrives this woman. And she finds out where Jesus is, and she goes up to his seat, and this overwhelming sense in her, this need in her to worship this guy Jesus, just breaks loose. She has in her possession this jar, this expensive jar made of marble, and inside that jar is perfume, is an oil, is an ointment that is incredibly expensive. That ointment would have cost you a year's salary to buy. And she cracks the seal on this jar, and she just smashes it and pours it all over Jesus. Some gospel writers say over his head, some say over his feet. It doesn't really matter. The point is, she pours it over him in this uncontrolled, irrational act of worship. Everybody else is looking at her, thinking, what the heck is she doing? In fact, Jesus, he's got some disciples, some guys that hang around with him the whole time, and he's training them up, and they're stood to one side, and one of them says, hold on. If you're going to waste this, if you're going to blow it all on his head or on his feet or whatever, why don't we get the perfume, put it on eBay, we could sell it, and at a high price we could give that money to the poor. That's the kind of stuff Jesus is involved in. I don't know if you've noticed, we could do that. And Jesus just allows this woman to carry on doing exactly what she's doing. It's something that starts in her gut. It's this overwhelming desire to have to worship this guy that looks at her differently, that appreciates her, that understands, that has compassion for her, empathy for her, acceptance for her. All these things that nobody else in the room has for her, Jesus has for her. She is, in her worship of him, uncontained. She isn't held back by what is acceptable at a party. She isn't held back by the social norms. She isn't held back by fear or embarrassment. She is uncontained in what she wants to pour out before this Jesus and on this Jesus guy. And that word uncontained is one, gang, that I want us to grab hold of for the next little while as we start to go nomadic, as we start to have church in different places all around the city and at different times, because God's people were always supposed to be uncontained. The reason they were supposed to be uncontained is that they mirror the character of a God who is uncontained. You can't put boundaries, or you can't put barriers or limits on the goodness or the grace or the mercy or the compassion or the forgiveness or the hope that you find in God. You can't limit that. He is not limited by expectations. He is not limited by my understanding of him. He is not limited by time. He is not limited by geography or race or color or ethnicity or language or gender or sexuality or politics or anything else. He is not limited. He is uncontained. His goodness is uncontained. And therefore, in mirroring that, God's people were all supposed to be uncontained. They were supposed to be this gang that wandered freely around wherever they found themselves. And they had this joy in their hearts that was uncontained. They had a love for others which was uncontained. They had a desire to share what they had which was uncontained. And they started off in tents. And when God said, stay where you are, they would pitch their tent and they would live there for a bit. When God says move, they would go, because they were never supposed to be contained. But what happened was, we got fed up with tents. We wanted something more. We wanted permanent toilets and a kitchen and a nice screen we could project onto, and we wanted an altar. And we started building temples and cathedrals and castles of religion. And we started to allow this thing to drip feed into our consciousness and into society's norm that those are the places where God lives. If you want to go to where God is, if you feel some sense in you that you need to go meet God somehow, to apologize for something or get forgiveness for something or pour out some worship or something, you got to go to where God lives, and he lives in a temple. He lives in a church. He lives in the building down the road that looks like a church. He lives in a cathedral. The woman at the party knew God doesn't reside solely in temples and cathedrals and churches. God was at a party, and she went to where God was, and she pours out this uncontained worship. She mirrors the character of God. She is uncontained. And the truth is that in a couple of days after this party, Jesus himself is going to kind of trump her actions, if you like. Just as she's poured out this incredibly expensive oil, he is going to pour out himself. Literally on the cross, the blood is going to flow from him, and he's going to have this incredibly expensive, costly self-sacrifice, which shows us the extent of his love. Her worship was uncontained, just like the people of God are supposed to be uncontained, and it's all because the grace of God is uncontained. So it's my prayer for us as we start to be nomadic that we would be like that, just wherever we find ourselves across Milton Keynes, that we would show joy and grace and love and peace and mercy to whoever we find ourselves. It's my prayer for you that you would experience the uncontained goodness and grace of God in your life. Is there a barrier on it at the moment? Is there a self-imposed limit? Is there a place where you don't expect God to be, where Jesus, you don't expect to find him sat down in your workplace or in a dinner party or in your family? Is there a limit that you've put on God? Because he doesn't play by those rules. He is uncontained. So may you know this week the uncontained goodness and grace and forgiveness and mercy and joy and peace of God in your life. Keep going, St. Mark's. If you've forgotten where you are in our Bible readings as we go through the discipleship booklet, pick it back up. We're going through some crazy stuff in Mark at the moment where Jesus keeps on beating all these obstacles thrown at him, all the obstacles of irreligion or disillusionment or illness or sickness or lack of hope or despair. Jesus shines a light into all those darkness. Keep going. Grace and peace, everybody.